Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen,
And I'm Paul Carter.
and we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, so today we're diving into some fascinating history. It's the restoration of the priesthood in the early days of Mormonism. We've got some interesting sources for this deep dive. The CES letter, excerpts from Mormon Think, and a really interesting episode from Mormon Stories, Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651. Get ready, because it's not as straightforward as you might think.
You got that right. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they present this very clear narrative. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery received the priesthood directly from heavenly messengers.
Yeah.
First John the Baptist, and later Peter, James, and John.
And that authority is like the cornerstone of their belief.
Right.
It sets them apart as the only true church. It allows them to perform those saving ordinances.
Absolutely. But here's where things get a bit tricky. The sources that you've brought to the table, they bring up some inconsistencies, like in the historical record, and they highlight how the story of this priesthood restoration, it seems to have evolved over time.
Okay, so let's unpack that evolution. The CES letter, it raises a big red flag. No contemporary accounts about these angelic priesthood restorations before 1834. We're talking 5 years, a full 5 years after they supposedly happened.
Right.
And even more curious is that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, they didn't seem to mention it to family or teach about priesthood authority during those early years.
And that silence is significant. You would expect such a momentous event, right? I mean, this is the event that essentially births the church and its authority, to be discussed and documented immediately.
That's a really good point. And to make things even more complicated,
Right.
we have the Book of Commandments, published in 1833, collection of revelations that Joseph Smith claimed to have received.
Yeah.
If the priesthood restoration was so central, wouldn't it be in this book?
You would assume so, but there's no mention of these angelic visitations or a formal priesthood restoration. It's as if these pivotal events, which later become fundamental to the church's narrative, just weren't on the radar yet.
But then things take a turn. The CES letter points out some really interesting additions made to those same revelations when they were later compiled in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And suddenly, verses about John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John appearing to Joseph and Oliver, they appear.
It's like a crucial part of the story was missing, and then boom, it's inserted later.
Yeah.
And this is where understanding the different types of priesthood becomes really important. The Aaronic priesthood, named after the biblical figure Aaron, is considered a preparatory priesthood, while the Melchizedek priesthood, named after a biblical king and priest, holds higher authority in the church.
So we have these two priesthoods, and the story of their restoration seems to be a little fluid.
Precisely.
The CES letter highlights that a revelation, originally about 193 words long in the Book of Commandments, expanded to a whopping 649 words in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants.
Wow.
And guess what those extra words contained? Detailed accounts of those angelic visitations and priesthood bestowal.
It really makes you wonder, like, what prompted those additions? Was it a genuine unfolding of understanding, or were there, like, other factors at play? That's a question worth exploring. And Mormon Think provides a really fascinating perspective on this. They present a really compelling chronology that maps out the evolution of the priesthood narrative, alongside some of the challenges that Joseph Smith faced as a leader.
Oh, I love a good timeline. Lay it on me.
Okay, so picture this. It's the early 1830s, and Joseph Smith is facing some serious pushback within the church. There are power struggles, financial disputes, and accusations of improper behavior swirling around him. Not exactly smooth sailing for a fledgling religious leader.
Sounds like a lot of drama in those early days.
Oh, there was plenty. Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, dives into a particularly heated conflict with a church leader named Edward Partridge. Partridge had serious concerns about how Joseph Smith was handling church finances. And he wasn't shy about voicing those concerns. He even used his position as bishop to challenge Joseph Smith's authority.
So what did Joseph Smith do?
He received a revelation. This revelation, later canonized as Doctrine and Covenants Section 50, called for a significant restructuring of church leadership. This essentially demoted Partridge and conveniently solidified Joseph Smith's authority by establishing him as the president of the high priesthood.
So that's a pretty strategic move. Use divine revelation to silence dissent, consolidate power. It's like something out of a political playbook.
It does raise questions, doesn't it, about how Joseph Smith may have used revelation to navigate these power struggles. And this pattern, it seems to repeat itself. According to Mormon Think, whenever Joseph Smith faced challenges to his leadership, he often received, let's call them convenient revelations, that reinforced his authority and discredited his opponents.
It almost makes you wonder, were these revelations genuinely from God? Or were they, shall we say, influenced by Joseph Smith's desire to maintain control?
That's a really good question. And Mormon Think argues that this connection between challenges to Joseph Smith's authority and the evolution of the priesthood narrative, it becomes even more apparent when we look at the details of the 1831 conference you mentioned earlier.
The one where the CES letter mentions evidence of Joseph Smith receiving the Melchizedek priesthood from Lyman White, not heavenly messengers.
That's the one. Mormon Think suggests that this conference, held amidst growing dissent and challenges to Joseph Smith's leadership, might have been a pivotal moment in shaping the priesthood restoration narrative.
It seems like we're starting to see a pattern here. Challenges arise, and a revelation conveniently emerges that strengthens Joseph Smith's position.
It's a compelling observation, and there's another layer to this story that we need to unpack.
Okay.
Both the CES letter and Mormon Think, they delve into the specific language used to describe the priesthood and how it seems to have shifted over time.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these linguistic shifts.
Well, they point out that the term Melchizedek priesthood, which is, now such a central concept in Mormonism, it doesn't actually appear in any church documents until after Sidney Rigdon joins the church in 1830.
So they're suggesting that maybe Rigdon, not Joseph Smith, was the one who introduced the concept of the Melchizedek priesthood. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. And Mormon Think backs it up by highlighting how the way the word authority was used in the early church, it differs from that later, more formal understanding of priesthood authority we see today. It's as though the concept itself was still being, developed.
Almost like it was a work in progress, being refined over time. Now, going back to that 1831 conference where Joseph Smith supposedly received the Melchizedek priesthood from Lyman White, what happened there? What do our sources say about it?
Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, points out a rather intriguing detail from that conference. They quote a historical record, which states, "The Melchizedek priesthood was conferred on each of the elders by Lyman White, who was assisted by Joseph Smith, Jr."
Wait, so if Joseph Smith was assisting Lyman White in conferring the Melchizedek priesthood, wouldn't that mean he already had it? How does that square with the later claim of receiving it from Peter, James, and John?
It's another one of those head-scratching moments where the timeline and the narrative, they seem to clash.
This whole thing is starting to feel like a puzzle with some missing pieces. We have these accounts of angelic visitations and priesthood restorations, but the details are murky, the timeline's jumbled, and the terminology seems to evolve over time. What are we to make of all this?
It's definitely a lot to process, and while we can't definitively say what Joseph Smith's intentions were, we can look at the evidence and consider some possible motivations behind these evolving narratives.
Okay, so let's put on our historian hats for a minute and try to understand what might have been going on. We've talked about those early challenges to Joseph Smith's leadership, the financial disputes, the power struggles. Do our sources connect those events to the priesthood restoration narrative in any way?
They absolutely do. Mormon Think suggests that Joseph Smith may have used the evolving narrative of the priesthood restoration to solidify his authority and silence dissent within the church. They argue that framing himself as the sole recipient of this divine authority would give him an almost unassailable position of power.
So the more his leadership was challenged, the more he emphasized these extraordinary claims of priesthood restoration.
That seems to be the pattern that emerges, and Priesthood Restoration episode 1651 offers a particularly striking example of this. They discuss how the narrative of the priesthood restoration gained prominence during a time of intense crisis within the church. The Kirtland Safety Society banking crisis of the mid-1830s.
Oh, right, the bank that Joseph Smith founded that ultimately collapsed, leading to financial ruin for many church members. That must have been a major blow to his credibility.
It was. And according to Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, it was around this time that even more detailed accounts of the priesthood restoration events began to circulate. It's as if Joseph Smith needed to, reinforce his divine mandate, to reassure those who were questioning his leadership in the wake of this financial disaster.
So in a time of crisis, a more elaborate emphatic story of priesthood restoration emerges. A pretty convenient coincidence, wouldn't you say?
It does make you wonder about the motivations behind those increasingly elaborate narratives. Was it a genuine effort to clarify and expand on a sacred event? Or was it a strategic move to regain trust and reaffirm authority?
And this isn't just about, abstract concepts of authority, is it? This priesthood restoration story, it had real-world implications for how the church was governed, how decisions were made, and ultimately who held power.
Exactly. And those power dynamics are a key part of understanding the complexities of this narrative. Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, argues that Joseph Smith may have used the concept of the priesthood, particularly the Melchizedek priesthood, to elevate his status, not just within the church, but within the broader religious landscape of his time.
How so? Was he trying to claim something unique, something that set him apart from other religious leaders?
It seems that way. Remember, the Book of Mormon itself, it makes no mention of a Melchizedek priesthood, but once that term is introduced and the narrative of its restoration by heavenly messengers takes hold, Joseph Smith has something that no other church leader can claim.
He's the sole conduit of this unique and powerful priesthood, a priesthood directly linked to Jesus Christ himself. This is a pretty potent claim in a religious landscape where authority is everything.
It is. And it's a claim that could have been very effective in attracting followers and consolidating power within the church. By emphasizing the Melchizedek priesthood, Joseph Smith was essentially creating a hierarchy, placing himself at the very top, as the one and only recipient of this ultimate spiritual authority.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. The priesthood restoration narrative evolves over time, becoming more elaborate and emphatic during periods of challenge and dissent. It's used to silence critics, solidify Joseph Smith's authority, and even position him as a uniquely powerful figure in the religious landscape of his time. It's a fascinating, albeit complex picture.
It is. And while we've explored some possible motivations behind these evolving narratives, there's another piece of the puzzle that we need to examine: the role of Oliver Cowdery.
Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith's close associate, and the alleged witness to many of these priesthood restoration events. Why is his role so significant?
Well, both Priesthood Restoration episode 1651 and the CES letter raise some fascinating questions about Cowdery's accounts of these events, particularly his descriptions of who restored which priesthood.
Oh, right. The CES letter even mentions a quote from David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon, who said he never even heard about an angel ordaining Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until 1834.
Exactly. And Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, dives deeper into the inconsistencies in Cowdery's own accounts. For example, he's quoted as saying, "The holy priesthood was conferred on us by the spirit of Elijah." But in later accounts, it's John the Baptist who is credited with restoring the Aaronic priesthood.
So even the primary witness to these events can't seem to keep the details straight. That's a pretty big problem for the official narrative, isn't it? Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench into the whole idea of like a clear-cut restoration event. If even Oliver Cowdery, who was supposedly there, gives conflicting accounts, it makes you wonder about the reliability of the whole narrative.
Right, and these inconsistencies in Cowdery's accounts, they raise these questions about how these events were, remembered and recorded, potentially reshaped over time. Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, argues that maybe these weren't, literal physical appearances by heavenly messengers, but rather more symbolic or visionary experiences.
So they're suggesting that maybe the way these events were interpreted and then later recounted was influenced by the evolving needs of the church and Joseph Smith's desire to solidify his authority.
Exactly. And this leads to a broader question about how we understand Revelation itself. Mormonism, it often presents a very literal view of Revelation, right? God speaks, the prophet writes it down. But what if it's a more nuanced process?
I'm open to interpretation.
Precisely. Priesthood Restoration, episode 1651, uses the analogy of the telephone game, where a message gets passed down a line of people and, changes along the way. They argue that Revelation might work similarly. What starts as a divine message could be filtered through the experiences, biases, and even subconscious desires of the person receiving it.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So even if we accept that Joseph Smith received some kind of divine communication, about priesthood,
Yeah.
it might not have been as clear-cut and unambiguous as the later narratives would suggest.
Right. And that human element in the process of revelation, it's something that isn't often acknowledged in Mormonism. It challenges the idea of the prophet as a perfect conduit for God's word.
I see what you mean. It's easier to accept a narrative without question if you believe it came, directly from God, word for word.
Yeah.
But if we acknowledge that human interpretation is involved, well, it requires a more critical approach.
Exactly. It encourages us to ask questions, to look at the historical context, to consider potential motivations, and ultimately it allows for a more nuanced understanding of how these foundational narratives, came to be.
Okay, so let's apply this more nuanced understanding of Revelation back to the priesthood restoration. If we accept that there's a human element involved, what does that tell us about the evolution of this story?
It suggests that the narrative we have today, it might not be an accurate reflection of what actually happened. It might be a version that's been shaped and reshaped over time to fit the changing needs of the church and its leaders.
So what are we left with then? If the official story is potentially unreliable, what can we say for certain about the restoration of the priesthood?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think there's a simple answer. What we can say is that the story, as it's presented, it's far more complex and layered than it initially appears. There are inconsistencies, changing details, and potential motivations that need to be considered.
It seems like we're ending this deep dive with more questions than answers, but I think that's okay. It's about acknowledging that these narratives, these foundational stories, they aren't always as black and white as they're presented.
I completely agree. And by exploring those gray areas, by asking those tough questions, we gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of history and ultimately of our own beliefs.
Well said. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, challenged some assumptions, raised some important questions, and hopefully encouraged you, the listener, to think critically about these historical narratives. So until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.